Yeah, unfortunately, HR actually complained about the number of tattoos that Mick had, and that's why, you know,
Yikes.
uh, it's
I didn't
awkward.
know
But
that.
David, I'm glad you were able to make time today for us here for Coffee Talk. It's
Yeah, please, no one tell them about the pyramid of pain.
it is. I have seen you at a pool party, and it's impressive how much you got that inked in on your back. Like I was not expecting from just shirt collar to waist.
It's always the
Little
I
back
did it all in
tattoo.
one session too.
one session. That's why you're known as David the Badass. It's kind of your background name. Thank you everyone for joining us here, Coffee Talk with Serge, with special guest David. Despite the greatly exaggerated discussion around Mick, he'll be joining us not for next round, but the one afterwards, taking a bit of a sabbatical for some things. So we're very excited to have a guest speaker today, Mr. David, and then in 2 weeks we'll have Shannon and maybe David as well. We'll see. We'll all be in person doing some things together in Las Vegas, which is very exciting. For those of you who've never joined Coffee Talk, I apologize ahead of time, but we're going to have 30 to 45 minutes of exciting diatribes and rants around breaking news events. I think we're talking about Netflix passwords today, and we have some other fun things coming on down the road here. So please join us. It's going to be a good time. My name is Ryan Kovar. This is Audra Streetman and David Bianco, and we're Serge. We're here to talk to you today. But first, let's talk about the news. Mr. Drew, the producer god.
All right, so first news story for today has to do with VMware ESXi servers. So threat actors are apparently exploiting a 2-year-old vulnerability in these servers to launch a large-scale ransomware campaign. The attack, it's called ESXi ARGS, I believe if that's how you say it. And it targets the hypervisor's OpenSLP service, which is actually disabled by default in software releases since 2021. So this vulnerability, it could be exploited by a threat actor who has access to the same network segment, and that's over port 427. And so ESXi, if you're not familiar with it, it's a type 1 hypervisor or bare metal. So it runs kind of like its own operating system, whereas like a type 2 hypervisor runs on top of an operating system. And organizations often use it to consolidate hardware resources. So the reason why this ransomware is called ESXi ARGS is because it leaves behind a file with .args extension. So in some cases, security researchers say that they've actually been able to restore the encrypted data. Apparently, there is some data within that file that's left behind that has to do with decryption. So interesting, I saw it was maybe in 2/3 of cases, these researchers say they've actually been able to restore some of the data. So it's not always 100% successful.
Yeah, we've had some questions. I've had some folks reach out to me, ask me my thoughts on this. What I find interesting, Shannon Davis, our beloved Serge Wombat down under, did a whole ransomware work last year. It was completely on Windows desktops. And I knew that ransomware did work on Linux, but my understanding on this is actually basically every major ransomware group now has variants that run on Linux, and the primary reason is actually to attack VMware ESX, which once again, we never victim blame here. We're just giving the facts as reported in the news and kind of discussing. So no shame against anyone who's getting compromised with or VMware for having a vulnerability that was patched 2 years ago. But it is an interesting area. David, you've had the most recent real world experience handling incidents and probably working in different places. What are your thoughts about this? Have you worked with ESX before?
Oh yeah, actually, I used to run one even at my home, and it is Linux based. It's got its own operating system, but it's really just a Linux based respin, just optimized for running VMs. And it's not really a surprise that a group would target ESXi, because these are kind of things that a lot of times they get put in the data center, and they're operating critical services or customer VMs, and nobody wants to touch it. Right? I mean, it should be a little surprising that people didn't update it or apply the security patches for 2 years. But from real world point of view, it's the kind of thing we see all the time in data centers and operational environments like that, where they just uptime is king. And so sometimes the critical security patches get skipped, unfortunately. And this is the kind of thing that we see. I mean, it's literally like the threat actors turned the Wayback Machine to 2 years ago because it came out. We're only a couple weeks shy of the 2-year anniversary of the patch for this coming out. So, they're still within their 2-year patch window. So I don't know what the problem
There you
is.
go. Yeah, it's all about POAMs. Yeah, I mean, ESX has been out for donkey years, right? 20 years, 15 years or something like that. We've been running ESX boxes. I do wonder how much of this is just, it's so far buried in the areas of people's data centers, or for folks who are coming up who are doing CMDBs. Like, everyone talks about the cloud. No one talks about the fact that data center runs on things that are actually critical, like ESX. Like, this is what a lot of data centers run to have it going. And Audra, you've been kind of going through your security and IT knowledge acquisition like a gangbuster for the last year. How much has ESX come up in your syllabi?
I actually believe it was on one of my multiple choice questions in a certification once, when you had to know the difference between different products, and VMware products were pretty common with that. But when it comes to virtualization, I mean, that's definitely, when it comes to networking, understanding how that's different with network segments compared to networks that aren't, or computers that aren't virtualized. So if that makes any sense, I believe, when this actually came out, it was an 8.8 CVSS vulnerability 2 years ago when it came out. So there is, a patch available that's, and I believe VMware has a whole write-up on this with more information. And I think it's a heat-based buffer overflow is the actual exploit involving that component of the hypervisor. So, it is concerning that this is actually a global ransomware campaign that they've been able to target, countries across the world, different servers. So I'm interested to see if that changes or if it slows down now that it's getting, more attention. So something to watch.
We have a comment from Nicole, and we love when people ask questions, especially if we can answer them. So feel free, if you're watching at home, chuck some stuff in there. Can you put security on bare metal that prevents unknown files from installing? I haven't touched ESX for a while, so David, it sounds like you might know more, but I seem to remember it's a custom version of Linux, and so you probably are able to install some basic security things on it. But the things I'd be looking for if I was setting up a threat hunt probably is, I know some of the areas for ESXi that ransomware runs for this are things like, I think it's stop VM or fork. There's some areas there that they're running to actually try to get the ransomware to execute that you're probably not seeing. But what are your thoughts, David? Anything that people can do on bare metal to reduce this risk if they're unable to patch?
Yeah, I'm not an ESX administrator, so I'm going to have to pass on that. To my knowledge, there isn't a whole lot.
And our legal team thanks you.
Yeah. But I would like to point out that you mentioned Shannon's research work from last year for ransomware encryption speeds. So there's actually a tie here to that work, because one of the things that he mentioned that he called out in his report about speeding up the encryption is some of the ransomware varieties only encrypt a piece of data, like, maybe the first parts of the file. What you were talking about, Audra, earlier about some researchers being able to recover the VMs is actually VMware VMs aren't just one file. They're a bunch of files, most of which are configuration, one of which is the disk image. And it turns out that in order to get this all done quick, they really only encrypted the configuration files, and mostly the disk image is totally untouched. So there are instructions out there that you can find that basically just say, if this applies to you, you may be able to recover by essentially creating fake files and manually editing them to what you think that they should be, and pointing them to the unencrypted giant big disk file. So it's kind of like they wanted it to be fast, right? So it could have the most impact in the least amount of time. But the trade-off was that sometimes if you know what you're doing, you might be able to recover.
Yep. And
so David, sorry, go ahead, Audra, please.
Well, I was just going to mention, I posted in the chat a link from VMware with more information on how to secure an ESX hypervisor. I can't talk.
Cuckoo.
Yeah, let's not go down that route today. So yeah, basically limiting access, least privilege, minimizing the number of open ports, host management, kind of typical things you might think of for securing. There's also lockdown mode, so that they can only be the host can only be accessed through the vCenter server by default is on here. So an interesting link anyway for more on securing it.
So David, if you were, David the badass, if you were in an organization that was like, oh, David, we just heard about this, we want to think more about ESX and, basically adversaries attacking ESX, and obviously you very wisely gave out the preliminary, like, I'm not an expert, but like, how would you start framing your hunt, or what were the questions you would start asking to be able to think about a threat hunting kind of hypotheses or routine around this kind of area?
Oh, yeah. So threat hunting inside ESXi environments would be pretty interesting. I've actually never done that, but I do know that they produce logs just like any other Linux system. The exact things that they're logging might be a little bit different because obviously there's some more pieces of vSphere and VMware and things that are creating those logs. But you do have the ability to centralize those logs through syslog because it's just a just a Linux machine. So, I mean, I would start by making sure all your logs go into the same place. Do an inventory of what kinds of things are getting logged across all your ESX servers everywhere. And then start, you can easily do what I call the exploratory data analysis piece, like, what things are logging, what subsystems are on all of the system,
Right.
all of the ESX servers, versus are there subsystems that are only enabled on like a couple of them or a few of them, and why is that? You could even get into things like common threat hunting, things like look for all the ones that say error or fatal or abort or something like that in there. Just look for, common keywords while you're orienting yourself to the data, because after you look through it for a little while, you'll get more of an idea of what things you want to drill down in. But those are the keys to like probably get started, like get all the data in one place, do some basic explorations and basic searches. And as you do those, you'll get more familiar with the data and be able to create better threat hunting hypotheses, I think.
Love it. Love it. What else do we have down the pipeline there, Ms. Audra?
So last night, the LockBit ransomware group actually listed Royal Mail on its extortion site. So according to this post on their data leak site, the British Postal Company has until this Thursday to pay the ransom, or else LockBit is threatening to leak its data. And so this was actually an attack last month on Royal Mail, and it brought the delivery of mail and packages basically to a halt. And the company appears to still be gradually recovering from this. And Royal Mail says there's no evidence so far suggesting that the data contains any sensitive customer information. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't know. I haven't seen a comment about whether or not they intend to pay or if they're not going to pay the ransom. But this was a fairly high-profile attack that had some cascading impacts in terms of people trying to deliver mail, and so it kind of reinforces the importance of resiliency as well. I know the NCSC put out an advisory highlighting the importance of resiliency when it comes to a ransomware attack and being able to recover in the event that your files are encrypted. Are you able to restore from backups? Do you have a contingency plan in place so that you're still able to operate? And so I think this is an example of that.
I am just blown away again by the arrogance of some of these ransomware groups. I mean, to go after something like the Royal Mail, I mean, you are basically just like, yeah, whatever. Literally, you can't touch us, and we don't care. That's a pretty big. I mean, the folks in Britain love their mail like we love our gas. So it'll be interesting to see if there's any sort of output here from the British government around attacking something that's so critical to the nation's well-being. I lived in the UK for 7 years, and a lot of things are done via the post that are not necessarily done as much here in the US. Is a really critical part for a lot of people's lives. So it'll be interesting to see what consequences LockBit faces or doesn't face after this. Does it embolden, or does it, make them rebrand, as someone at the SANS CTI Summit gave a talk on recently? Andrew Brunch bringing up Bunch. I apologize. How often do ransomware groups get caught? Well, that's an interesting question. Audra, I know we've talked a lot about this. What are your...
Yeah, well, I'm interested to see if the FBI in the US continues its operation of trying to infiltrate these ransomware groups. They've already done it with REvil. They did it recently with Hive, being able to take down their infrastructure. And in some cases, it's actually led to, indictments and arrests. So I do think that there are examples like that where, authorities are able to, I guess, catch ransomware criminals, but it is difficult to prosecute when you're talking about, the affiliate model with, operators in Russia, for instance, and, basically immunity from U.S. prosecution because of where they might be located. So,
I mean, to be fair, though, the Russian officials pointed out that they would have prosecuted more people if only the U.S. government was more forthcoming with their sources and methodologies. So, I mean, really, it's the FBI's fault, if you think about it.
Well, I'm not going to say anything about fault, but...
Audra Streetman says FBI not doing their job because of you, Russia. That's what I heard. Breaking news.
That is not what I just said, Ryan.
That's what I said you said, and that's basically the same.
You're putting words in my mouth.
David, what are your thoughts around this, or attribution, or catching folks? What do you think? Coffee talk.
Yeah, I think especially if you were the ransomware operator and you're at least even just a little bit smart, it's probably a pretty safe business model for you. It's like I think most of the risk here is probably on the affiliates that are directly, exploiting the systems. It seems like they're more likely to get caught and traced. And I don't know, and especially what you said about the varying jurisdictions and their desire to cooperate with the U.S. I mean, yeah, I don't think it happens that often, but you don't have to catch them to put the pressure on them. Like, I think you started to mention this, Ryan. There was a really good talk about ransomware groups rebranding last week at the SANS CTI Summit, and I'm sorry, I forgot the speaker's name, but he basically talked about how this happened, what circumstances were, especially with some real world examples, and it happens probably more than you would normally think. Like, oh, it's getting too hot here for us. Our name is too well known and associated with, I don't know, killing people from ransoming hospitals. Maybe we'll just change our name and our brand and we'll go on. Or ransomware groups splinter, like they have internal disagreements and things like that, and they just create new ones. It just happens.
Yeah, the speaker was Drew Schmidt, and SANS CTI, wonderful conference. You can watch it online. I think the talks are going to be posted in a couple of weeks, and if Drew is able to, there's actually a great illustration. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Drew. One of the wonderful parts about SANS conferences is they have a phenomenal illustrator who kind of goes through and pulls up the high points, and I think this is going to be a good talk for folks who are curious about it. It's one of the reasons I love SANS summits, because you get information like this, easy to share, easy to consume. So definitely something you're interested in, please take a look through. But yeah, I know that one aspect of this is ransomware attacks have increased, but the amount of payouts have decreased. And partly that's because organizations are realizing that you can't pay your way out of ransomware for sure. And then secondary is, at least in the US, and I know we've talked about this before, Audra, like, you don't know who you're paying. If LockBit ends up being associated or labeled a terrorist group in the US or the UK, we tend to work pretty, side by side with that. You've now funded terrorists, and that's not a great idea for your business overall. So,
yeah,
I think the way to go after a lot of these ransomware is not necessarily through technological methodologies or prosecution, but at their wallet. Disincentivize people from paying because you can recover quicker, or legalities of, hey, you can't pay to get the key, so sorry.
Yeah, and I especially like hearing that the FBI tends to hide out in these networks for a little bit, and they collect, intelligence. They're able to monitor and kind of see how these groups operate. And with the Hive example of the FBI taking down the Hive infrastructure, they actually observed that only about 20% of Hive victims reached out to law enforcement. So that's kind of the tricky thing with ransomware, is actually measuring payments and, the number of victims. It's difficult because a lot of it's not publicized or reported. So
I'm just happy to hear you say something positive about the FBI after your vitriol earlier.
That did not happen. All right, moving on.
They're getting,
So,
people have this thing where they're embarrassed to admit that they had a cybersecurity incident, or maybe they're worried about the legal repercussions. So,
exactly.
and this is something I used to hear a lot more. They're worried about if they engage law enforcement will then try to run the investigation for their own, in their own interests rather than the victims.
Yep, exactly. So our third story today is the Ukrainian government actually put out a report recently. I believe it was last week. And this is about the Russian-sponsored hacking group Gamaredon, if I'm saying that right. So the report states that this group has been conducting campaigns against Ukraine using variants of GammaLoad or GammaSteal, which are versions of a PowerShell info stealer. And these are not new tools. This group has been known to employ that for a while now. But these attacks, they often involve phishing emails designed to look like they come from actual Ukrainian organizations. And they contain malicious LNK files. And only users with a Ukrainian IP can actually open these files, according to the report. So this group in particular is being labeled one of the most active in terms of targeting Ukraine, and so is definitely one of the largest threats in terms of cyber activity directed toward the country.
I know I've had a lot of questions over the last year. It started off with, we're really worried about Ukraine or Russian APT actors, and then it kind of bounced the other side where I started picking people being like, you were really saying Russia APT this, that, but I think it's really overblown. And I think we've talked about this before on the show, but I still think of Russian APT groups as some of them are apex predators in the world of APT, but there is a difference. Not every APT group is the same, and not every organization has the same rules of engagement or targeting, and not every APT group within Russia has the same skill sets. So, these are ones that I put up pretty high on the list. When you look at, what's it called? I was going to say Tesla, but that's not the right one. I'll come back. Turla. I mean, Turla does cool stuff. They bounce off of satellites. Like, they're just wicked cool. APT 28 and 29 can do some really cool stuff if they put their minds to it. So there's a lot of stuff here that I find interesting. It's not going away. But, once again, David, I haven't hunted Russian groups for a while. I know you probably have more experience recently. Kind of when you read a report like that, when you read active information, kind of how do you put on your threat hunting hat or running these sort of operations again? Where do you kind of start thinking? What do you start looking at for the folks who are curious?
This report actually was a pretty good report. It was actually a really great report for exactly what you just asked, because if I'm as a threat hunter, I want to understand it. One of the things I really liked about that report was they led with an infographic that actually just says, here's all the details of the entire attack chain. There's like 4 different loaders involved in there, and they call out the flow of information, but also the IOCs, at least partially, in that graphic. So it makes it really easy to kind of understand what's going on. They kind of followed that almost like the bottom line up front kind of thing, whereas here's the pieces that you really need to know in order to protect yourself, and then we'll drill down into some of those later. But one of the things that I found that was during my research on this group that was really interesting. First of all, Audra, nobody knows how to say their name.
I can guess myself.
Literally watched a bunch of YouTube videos, and it was Gamaredon, Gamaredon, and some
that's
other
my
ones.
favorite. Gamaredon, that wins.
Yeah, Gamaredon versus Godzilla.
Mm-hmm.
That's a movie right there. That's a blockbuster hit. But I mean, you look at the report, and it's almost tailored for threat hunting, because it tells you everything you want to know. You even got screenshots of Wireshark protocol decodes and stuff for the C2s. So it's actually just kind of all laid out in there for you if you want to try to find that activity in there. And Ukraine putting this out after all the stuff they're going through, when you say, everybody says, well, Russian APT is not that big of a deal. There's probably no one in Ukraine is saying that right now. I think
Yeah.
most of these groups are under state or control or partial state control. They're getting redirected to something else right now, maybe not the rest of the world. So if you're thinking that Russian AP is not as big of a deal, consider whether it's just because they're too busy to worry about you right now.
We got some other things, different targeting, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I do love about this is that, we recently, Dr. Ryan Fetterman gave a presentation, wrote a blog post where he took open source intelligence reports from the NSA, from CISA, from Mandiant, from Red Canary, and kind of tried to use some data sciencery to figure out what the top things you should look at are. And kind of going through this report earlier, I was very happy and not shocked to find out many of his conclusions are actually areas that I would have focused on to be able to start threat hunting or create detection engineering on going through this report. There's a lot there. I mean, once again, the attack chain overflow, starting at the very beginning, it is a spear phishing email, right? It's using PowerShell at some point. It's got VB script. It's got domain callouts to raw IP addresses. These are things you can actually find, overcome, and detect. So it also gives me a lot of faith because, it's a PowerShell script that's running. It's going off to a base IP address. It's downloading things. There's a lot of places here for hunting or detection engineering to do good things.
Yeah, and that whole attack chain is basically like a textbook example of an attack chain for this kind of attack. Like you said, phishing, there's RAR files with malicious links in them that lead to download a new stage, and finally you get to the end, and that's when like the act on objective phase of the kill chain, it kind of opens up. But everything to get there is just right out of a textbook.
I love that, Dave. You're 100% right. This is like, if you were to send someone like baby's first APT attack, like this white paper would be like, read this. Let's discuss. Okay, you understand 70% of APT attacks now. You're good to go. Like,
yeah. And I think with Ryan's research, wasn't it that he found that PowerShell was actually the most common technique citing across all of the reports that he analyzed? So just another example of where to prioritize your defenses and also threat hunting.
If you don't have PowerShell logging enabled in your environment, do it. I remember Steve Brandt and I, a former Splunker, gave a talk in 2016, and we surveyed about 100 companies, and only 5 of them were actively logging any sort of PowerShell. And of those, like 5, I think only 2 would have been able to detect what I consider to be useful areas there. So if you don't have command line scripting enabled somewhere, if you don't have PowerShell block, all the sort of things that you can get around, there's a lot now for it. If you don't have an EDR tool that can detect, drive towards it, because there's a lot of power there. Yeah. Tick tacos, 100%. Do it. Log PS, 100%.
Yep. Awesome. Well, shall we move on now to our upcoming events? We have an exciting announcement with David and myself. We're both speaking at RSA conference coming up in April, which is really exciting. So David, do you want to talk a little bit about your talk and some of the research that you're working on?
Oh, sure. So one of the first things when I came to Surge is I had to figure out a research project. And Ryan actually was like, look, you're at the only place in the world that has an unlimited Splunk license. What can you do that makes use of that? And so what I decided to focus on was I was really curious about certificate trust, especially in our web browsers, but not entirely. We have like 50 different ish root certificate authorities that get trusted by our browsers. Like Chrome, I think specifically has around 50 of them that ships with. And anything signed by one of those root CAs is trusted. But who validates whether the level of trust on those CAs is warranted? Google tries. They and the other major web browsers make the CAs publish documents that say what their policies and procedures are and things like that, which is useful. But there's also a lot of use in measuring the actual outputs of those CAs to see if they're doing their thing. So what we did was we downloaded 5 billion certificates off the internet from the certificate transparency logs. The certificate transparency logs, we focus on primarily 2020 2021 and 2022 logs. And we downloaded about 5 billion of them. It's not every certificate issued on the internet, but very, very close. Yeah, it's the majority of them. And we cross-reference them with a number of different threat intelligence sources that we partnered with. Some of them are publicly available, some that we actually partnered with the company to bring in their threat intel databases, just to see which of those certificates we could find actually had positive malicious observations for spam, phishing, malware, C2, etc. And then we're in the middle of doing the analysis phase of that right now. So looking for root CAs and perhaps also issuing CAs that are more or less trustworthy than the average CA, and then to see if we could cross-reference with those policies and procedures to see if we could explain why they might be outliers. So that's what it's about. We'll talk about how we did it. There's a lot of challenges with data at this scale as well, but we'll also talk about the findings, of course, and hopefully it'll be a really fun session. So
yeah,
I'd like to see a lot of you there.
Definitely looking forward to what you find out with the analysis. It's really, really interesting and a lot of data, which, you know, having a Splunk license definitely helps with that. So
but I want to hear about you now.
Yeah. Nice try, Audra. Nice try to get out of it. David and I both noticed.
So I'm actually giving a talk with Lillian Tang, who works at Capital One in threat intelligence. And so Lillian, actually, Ryan, when you were first creating Surge, you had an idea for a job posting that was more entry level, possibly, you know, looking for career changers, someone with a communications background. And, you know, Lillian has done a ton of work in terms of diversity and inclusion and, you know, considering diversity of thought when hiring, right? How important it is to have a diverse team. And so she helped draft the job posting for Splunk, which I eventually applied to and was very fortunate to get the job here as a career changer coming from a communications background. So that's what we're going to talk about, is how you don't necessarily have to have a specific background to work in cybersecurity. There are lots of different skills that people can bring to the table, and also the importance of training as well, you know, learning on the job and how, you know, hiring managers can help facilitate that. So that's our talk. We're just now starting to develop that. And we also have a Women in Tech bots competition coming up March 6th. So that's going to be in Washington, D.C. Very excited about that as well. So those are some upcoming events. And David, I also think we have another something to highlight for you, because today you had an article that came out, and this was in TechCrunch. And this is about the defender's dilemma and why that's a lie. So do you want to explain that real quick, what that means?
Yeah, so people probably know the defender's dilemma. It's this idea that the defenders have to be right all the time in order to protect their network, but the attackers only have to be right one time to breach your defenses and, you know, execute ransomware on your ESXi servers or whatever, right? But that might used to have been true a long time ago, but it hasn't been true for a really long time, and it's certainly not true today. In fact, the article basically lays out 5 things that are consequences of the the defender's dilemma that are also untrue. And you know, of course, it's TechCrunch, so they want to have nice you know, solution-oriented articles. So actually, I pointed out the 5 lies that underlie the defender's dilemma, and provided some actionable, hopefully, suggestions for how to overcome those and actually turn them into advantages for your security team. It's a really hopeful article. Like, it's a lot of security stuff is like, oh, it's all doom and gloom. We're all doomed. It's just a matter of time before we get breached. And one of the things I liked about writing this article was that it gives you some hope that it's not all bad. We actually talk about what we call the attacker's dilemma. Like, we have a lot of advantages on the defense side that the attacker has to all evade. So I'd encourage you to go check it out, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think about that too with like the cyber kill chain, right? Like, it represents 7, or I guess 6 points in an attack where you have an opportunity to defend your network, right? So it's not just, you know, one thing and then it's, you know, your defenses, or it's your whole operation is ruined. There's a lot of opportunities and a lot of ways you can defend. So I think it's a really great point.
It's an attack life cycle, and the threat actors have to get around all your defenses and detections across the entire life cycle. Otherwise, you have a chance to jump in and shut them down.
Exactly. Yep. Great. Well, I think we have another slide, Drew, for that I threw together last night. It was yesterday was a long day, so I put this slide together around 9 o'clock.
This is an important thing. We don't necessarily talk about it as much, but for those interested, we highly recommend signing up for our quarterly newsletter, which also is in our alerts. So I know Drew is going to throw this in the Slack or the LinkedIn chat. We'll throw it up on YouTube here in a bit. But the general concept, you go to splunk.com/surge. If you go all the way to the bottom, there's a sign up link for the newsletter and alerts. If you like this sort of content, the things we're creating, the places we're presenting, the videos we create, sign up for the newsletter. Audra also curates an incredible wombat fact, which you'll have to find one of us at a bar to understand why our team loves wombats so much, but it has to do with the skeleton, long story, but absolutely beloved mascot of the team. But check that out. And that's also where, when we do a rapid response for Splunk, when we respond to a major security incident, a Log4Shell, a Hafnium attack, things like that. Last year, I think we did 7 or 8 of them total. That's where we're going to send out an email notification to folks to get the latest information. But if you want the newsletter, it does fall under the lovely guidelines of EU as marketing, I guess. So keep that click through. But either way, highly recommend it. A lot of fun. You can learn more about what we're doing. And then the final part, as a reminder, starting in March, we're going to be going to every week. We've settled on the name, Coffee Talk with Surge one-on-ones, where Audra, Mick, myself, and maybe David and Shannon will all be giving more intimate interviews with a person. We have a whole list of exciting folks pulled from our Rolodexes and internal at Splunk to talk about research. We're going to be pulling members from the threat research team internal at Splunk to talk about some of their deep dive detections. We're going to be talking to CISOs about leadership. We're going to be talking about people who create geometric models for cyber, because that's our number one favorite thing to do after threat hunting, is create geometric shapes and assign meaning to them. So stay tuned. Starting in March, we're going to be doing that every week, and you can find us 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, and then all the time zones around the world that I can't remember included. So with that, I think it's time for producer Drew says he's looking forward to geodesic domes as a threat model. So David, time to upgrade the pyramid of pain to the geodesic dome of despair.
Yeah, I don't even know where to begin with that.
With all the advanced threats, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's going to be hard. Great. Let's think about this charity challenge that I didn't prepare well for. What a roll clip, Drew. And now, Splunk's Cybersecurity 60-second charity challenge. Remember the rules. You've got to get through an entire subject in 60 seconds, or you donate to today's charity of choice. Good luck!
All right, so today's charity challenge has to do with Netflix and its crackdown on password sharing. So this has been a little bit vague. Netflix has said in the past and continually that they are going to eventually crack down on password sharing, but it's still a little bit unclear exactly how that's going to play out in the United States. So Netflix updated their US Help Center page about how this might look for customers, but then they took it back. I believe this was actually applying to its pilot program in Latin America, where they are actually trying to tie households to devices, or to accounts rather, using like IP address or device IDs, account activities. So that way, if you log into a device that's not linked to your household, then you would have to verify who you are by using, a verification code to your phone or email. In the pilot program, it's unclear if that's exactly what's going to happen in the US in the coming months. There was also a note about potentially having to re-log into your account every month if you're not actively using it. So I wanted to ask you, Ryan and David, both of you, about your take on this, the vagueness from Netflix, the pilot program, And then also just password sharing in general. Like, what should people know about this in terms of, just general cybersecurity with sharing passwords? So not
The
sure
one thing we'll call out here is, obviously this isn't a knock on Netflix at all. This is really around a conversation of the passwords, because that is our modern life, right? Is dealing with complex, long passwords, and what does that mean, and kind of expanding upon that, right? So no knock on Netflix at all for changing their T&Es. It's more surprising they hadn't done this 10 years ago than it is anything else, I think.
Yeah, and I think, the vagueness is part of the strategy, right? Because if they did this all at once across the board, I think there would be a lot more outrage, right?
Yep.
So having it be a gradual rollout, a pilot program, I mean, it makes sense from that point of view. But
that was their way of floating a Chinese spy trial balloon.
Yeah,
exactly.
Thankfully, they did not muster the F-22s to shoot down that idea. So.
No, we saved that for Wizards of the Coast.
There we go. And we have a charity today, Audra, I believe.
Yes, so the charity that we selected this time is the International Medical Corps, and we did this because this organization is currently coordinating rescue and recovery efforts in Turkey after the large earthquakes this week, and also damage in Syria as well. So that is the charity this week.
And David, thank you again for donating ahead of time. Obviously, you're going to lose. And as a reminder, Splunk has a wonderful benefit of they match our donations. So it's $60 from us and then $60 match by Splunk, which is a really great opportunity. David, as the challenger and most likely victor, I will let you select who goes first today.
You were just all over this. One sentence I'm going to win. The next sentence I'm going to lose.
I'm covering all my bases, baby. Yeah. Straddling the fence.
You're like, look, I totally Nostradamus it. I got it. You know what? I will be gracious. I'll let you go first. I prefer to bet.
I was going to steal all your ideas and take credit for it, but sure, whatever. That's fine. Okay, let's see how I do with very little preparation today after a very busy afternoon or morning. Drew, let's get 60 seconds. So let's go. I think the critical part for me that I was impacted personally by this change is I find that when I travel, and I used to travel extensively, I often would bring my Netflix account with me depending on where I was in the world. In order to do that, I would have to log into a password, the system. I'd have to use my little controller and put it in. That inherently weakened my password because my normal 30-character long password phrase wasn't really suitable for a remote control. If we expand this past just the Netflix side of it, I personally think it's a step in the wrong direction away from a passwordless environment that we should be moving to with MFA authentication, various options there, rather than putting something static in. I think it does disincentivize having a more secured account for something that has my credit card information. Once again, no knock on Netflix for doing something right for their business as I see it, but I do find, and I do personally know, that I will have a weaker password for a streaming account that I have to primarily ingest a password with remote than I would do if I was able to use an MFA or something like that. All right, David, to the victor goes the spoils. Or maybe not.
Well, in security, we say everyone should use their own accounts everywhere, but we're actually often forced into sharing. So, for example, my wife and I have a single PayPal account because we share credit cards and PayPal can't deal with it. Most companies actually suck at shared accounts. I'm always getting things shipped to my wife because PayPal, again, defaults to the last shipping info used, and I forget to check. Sure, some allow multiple user profiles, but even then, if I just click on a show, I don't know whose profile I'm watching it under, probably whoever watched something last. Don't even get me started on typing passwords on my remote. I just want to watch TV, not warm up for the U.S. men's Thumb Olympics team. Thankfully, most of the streamers allow you to log in via your phone, but not all. The fact is, many companies are using decades-old sharing playbooks. Companies, let's do what we need to do for you to make money while making account sharing easier for your customers.
Wow, with time to spare.
Yeah, so confident. The arrogance. The arrogance. With 5 seconds left, walks away, drops the mic on the stage.
It's only arrogance if I don't win.
We already have folks coming in. Riri 2, David wins.
Yes,
Audra,
I agree.
do you concur?
I agree.
I concur. I mean, it's just embarrassing. That was pathetic. Man, I think, yeah, Tick Tacos. Wow, David, +1. At this point, I don't even know if I should compete anymore. It's just going to be the David show. We're just going to bring David on for Charity Challenge, and I'll just pay. Sad, embarrassing.
We
do have a. Sorry, go ahead, David. More? Do you want to walk away and just rub my face in it now?
No, I just want to know if I can get your time too.
You didn't even use all of yours, so what would you do with it? Just stare in dominance?
Oh
Man, I had lots of jokes I had to cut for time.
And yet I was the biggest joke of all.
Well, let's transition away from that then. We have our deep dive we want to talk about, so let's go ahead and do that.
And now we talk about things that just happen to be on our minds with who's ever here, because we made this up before I knew who'd accept my meeting invite. And David, you're whoever's here.
Accepted.
Whoever.
So AI is a topic we've been talking about quite a bit with ChatGPT and just all the ways that it's kind of changed our lives since that was introduced. But yesterday, Google announced that it's rolling out its ChatGPT equivalent, which is called Bard, if I'm saying that correctly. And this is powered by Google's Lambda technology, its language model for dialogue applications. So, just seeing that this is now its own product offering from organizations to try to find AI products and the ways that it can help with our workflows, especially in cybersecurity. So I'm curious, Ryan and David, how you plan to use this going forward and ways that you can see it changing how we do our jobs.
I mean, I can start real fast and say that David and Shannon Davis have proven to me that I don't need to hire more people. I just need to give training on ChatGPT. We've seen a lot of stuff online. Sergio, good friend of the show, good friend of mine, had a great blog post he recently wrote. David, you can pronounce his last name, I can't. But Sergio C., father of threat intel and the diamond model, had a great post on how to use, or how not to use ChatGPT for threat intel reports. Our team has seen a lot of success in using it as a force multiplier. David, you've crushed this. You and Shannon both have really, turned into 10x engineers. Thank God, using this. So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I sucked before last month.
It was pathetic, frankly. All pyramid, no pain. If I'm honest.
Yeah.
Or no,
yeah.
all pain, no pyramid. There we go. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
See, you should ask ChatGPT to write that joke for you.
Oh, ayo.
Yeah, no, we really have used it. Shannon and I have both used it a lot, just kind of experimenting with it. We're trying to figure out what the actual use cases are where you could use it successfully or maybe unsuccessfully. So that was actually Sergio, and I believe you pronounce his name, Catagerone, of the Threat Intel Academy. Yeah. He actually wrote a blog post just a few days ago, I think the end of last week, that specifically called out the limitation of ChatGPT because he saw people were starting to use it or experimenting with it to create threat intelligence products like reports and things like that. And we're not quite there yet. I mean, it's a very convincing fake of a person's judgment, but there is no actual judgment. It doesn't know when it's wrong. And that's the biggest thing. But I have found out, and I think Shannon would probably back me up on this. We've used it. We've experimented with it so much. We have given it our own nickname. Shannon calls him Steve. Always like, Steve says this.
That did become ubiquitous. I don't know how he picked that name, but at this point, it's just like, oh, what's Steve think? Have you asked Steve? Yeah. Oh, does Steve help with this? Actually, Shannon, bad news. Steve's taking your job.
We still need Shannon to type the prompts. So
true. 100 million monkeys on a keyboard, one Shannon. That's there we go.
But about 2 weeks ago, I think it was, I actually asked Steve to create a Python script for me because I needed a graphic, like a graph diagram in my document that I was writing. And I was like, here's my requirements, my input data, write me a Python code and to generate the graph. And it did, and it worked. I didn't get my requirements quite correct the first time. So the chat interface was really convenient. But I was there and I knew what I was looking at too. so I could correct it and keep it on track. I would never just be like, write something and then ship it off to a customer or whatever without use. It's a force multiplier, but it still requires, I think, the human force in it. I'm really excited about some other use cases that we have identified but haven't even really tried yet. Like it's really good at explaining Splunk queries or writing them. I think it could be really cool to use as an assistant in threat hunting. Hey, I need a graph that looks like this, or I need to do this kind of analysis. Write me some code that accepts this kind of data and outputs this thing. You can't trust it will do the right thing, but with a human that is able to put a little judgment into it and guide it, it can really be, it's like a turbo booster when it's used properly.
Yeah,
Right.
Andrew Brunch, but actually Bunch, although yes, Andrew, happy to go have brunch at DEF CON or Black Hat if you're around, says it's very polarizing. I will be very polarizing on this. I think this is a major shift in our entire world of cybersecurity. I remember when Google came out and people were like, what, are you just going to Google everything? Yeah, hell yeah, I am. That's how I basically do my job every day. I think in the future, we're going to look at ChatGPT as exactly that. It's like the third analyst in the room. It's going to be a force multiplier for you to be able to do your job better with larger amounts of information. Stop doing the boring stuff. Let computers do what computers are good at. Let people do what people are good at. Jags and Thomas Rid just gave a course at Johns Hopkins where they tested having ChatGPT as an accessory for students for a reverse engineer malware. RE is hard, and they found a significant faster adoption for students using ChatGPT as an accessory to explain complex subjects to them than they would have otherwise. So I'm super pumped on it. I'm also super pumped on caffeine. So I'm going to stop for a moment. Audra, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's, obviously there's a lot of use cases for this where it can be very helpful. I used it the other day to help me brainstorm some name ideas because I was struggling with creativity. So I just asked ChatGPT, what's a good name for this? What's a good name for that? And it helped me start, brainstorming. But I also will say that it's important to know the limitations of AI, especially when it comes to bias and the potential for misuse. ChatGPT, for instance, learns based off of the input, right? As people continue to input information, it continues to learn based off of that. And that can, create biases. It can also, as Sergio pointed out in his blog, it could be used by adversaries potentially for interference. There's a lot of things potentially to look at. And it's, I guess there's AI literacy, right? Just like with Google searches, you have to know how to properly research. So if you're doing a Google search, how do you know what sources to pursue from that result list? And I think that also applies with AI, the ability to recognize if maybe the results that you're getting aren't accurate and being able to fact check. So I think that's important too. So it's very interesting. And I will point this out too. I'm listening to an audio book about AI, and I might have to post this after the fact. It's called How to Stay Smart in a Smart World by Gerd Gigerenzer. And it's very interesting. It's all about the limitations of AI. And it talks about all kinds of things like the stable world principle, which basically explains why chess is so easy for AI to be so successful with, because it's a game with like a set of rules.
Yeah, a finite number of outcomes.
Yeah, whereas if you had kind of a more unpredictable environment, AI might be less successful. So things like that to keep in mind with limitations, I think, is important. That's my take on it.
Well, we are.
Thing to kind of keep in mind is we're pontificating about the impact of AI right now on the world, but we're actually at probably the exact wrong time to do that, because it's changing so much right now. Like hour to hour, companies are introducing new AI technologies to create music, to write code, to all the chat interface, or even just the ability to write an essay on something. I think it might be a while before it settles down enough so that we can actually judge the true impact. Maybe we'll all collectively decide that it's not as much of an impact as we might think it is now. or maybe it'll be more. And maybe we'll find out we're in the middle of a mini singularity right now. We don't know.
I mean, this is a perfect segue. We're a little bit over today, but a good conversation. I think it's time to pull back the curtain. For those of you who don't know, Mick, Audra, and David were all out today. These are actually deep fakes, and it's been Steve the whole time behind the scenes. It's like Scooby-Doo. That's why David's a little pixelated. Audra's mouth was a little out of sync. Not even here. Just not even here. Really incredible. Steve, thank you for your time. It's been incredible. Really cutting costs here.
Meeting you all later. I mean, meeting you in person at a conference later.
I, for one, welcome our robot AI overlord, Steve. But thank you very much, everyone who joined. David, thank you very much. You were able to join with a very late notice, and we appreciate that significantly. It's been a fun conversation. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Like I said, we'll have Shannon Davis in person. David should be there. We'll have a couple other folks in person. And then starting in March, I think March 7th is the first day we come back. Is that right, Audra? I think.
Yes. The
March
first
7th,
Tuesday
we'll
in
be
March.
back.
Yeah.
First Tuesday in March. Wise woman. First Tuesday in March, we start every Tuesday. So start chanting in for that. And like we said earlier, smash that like and subscribe Surge sign up button. That'll be awesome. Thank you all very much for coming. And Drew, please take us away. Surge.